Welcome to When Women Preach. This podcast exists to empower AAPI and Latina women faith leaders. It was created and is hosted by Isaac, the innovative space of Asian American Christianity, where our mission is to soar beyond seminary. My name is Cris Otonari. We are also here with our co-founder and CEO of Isaac, as well as the founder of this podcast, Young Lee Hertig. Our guest for this episode is Russell Jeung, a sociologist, professor, longtime advocate for the AAPI community, and co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, which has been an invaluable resource that was birthed in response to the COVID crisis. And he is a dear friend of Isaac. Russell, welcome to When Women Preach. We're so excited to have you, and thank you for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Well, we can just jump right in. We're anxious to hear your stories and insight. We know that you've dedicated a lot of your career to addressing racism and advocating for justice, particularly within the Asian American community. In your research and activism, have you seen examples of how the lack of representation in leadership, especially in faith spaces and with Asian American women ministers, can you see how that impacts Asian American communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my first point to that is I've been working with the Asian American Foundation, and they did a survey, and Asian Americans as a group are the racial group least likely to feel accepted in the United States. We have the lowest sense of belonging in the United States. And when asked why, Asian Americans stated it's because we don't see anybody in leadership who look like us.
Right.
And so there clearly is a glass ceiling in a lot of industries. And because there was, the surge of anti-Asian hate and microaggressions, the lack of leadership and then the discrimination we face shapes that sense of non-belonging, shapes our feeling of feeling unaccepted. And so the lack of
Yeah, go ahead.
so the lack of role models, the lack of seeing faces like ourselves makes us feel we don't have opportunities, that we can't participate as much as we want to, and that we're not fully included. And in faith spaces, it's the same process, I believe, that if half our community aren't represented in leadership, then they're effectively blocked. And all those talents, all those skills, all those insights of that group are neglected and omitted, and not only do women lose out on their opportunities, but then men lose out on the talents, gifts, and insights of the rest of the community. So to me, the lack of representation really has negative consequences for our community, and particularly for our faith communities. Because again, we lose out on what God's diversity, we lose out on what God wants for us.
I cannot agree with you any better than what I witnessed. A lot of pastora, we've reached over 150 Asian American women ministers, and they're all outsourced. And I don't know whether Asian American churches even realize what kind of talent pool that they are missing out. And these women, very competent women, they're all serving gray-haired Caucasian churches. And Chris is one of them too. So my question to you, as you shared, why do you think that is, that we are not represented? We are lagging behind Black and Latino.
Well, first of all, in terms of women are always leading, right? And so it's not like there's a lack of leadership, and they are leading in their churches and our churches, but they're not getting pulpit positions or paid positions or ministry positions.
Right.
And there's different reasons for why Asian American churches are less likely to have Asian American women as ministers. Some of them, again, are theological reasons, and I think that becomes the basis for a lot of churches.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's, some Asian American, well, not some, there's Asian American patriarchy where men want to maintain their privilege and their power. And then they justify theology to back up their patriarchy, which is sort of scary. And then there's cultural reasons of, given that traditional pattern and the institutional languages, it does sort of discourage women from going into ministry. So I think, more women would go into ministry and leadership positions if, again, given the opportunity, if they had role models and if they had different kinds of theologies that encouraged them.
It's interesting that Isaac's national survey, according to its data that Jerry Park tabulated and analyzed, men said it's biblical reason why there's less women occupying position. Women said lack of exemplars and lack of representations. It's catch-22.
Yeah.
Men are saying biblically, theologically, you are not welcome here. And then women say, if we don't see our exemplar, just like you mentioned about, racial representation that Asian Americans lack, then how do we tackle this issue?
Yeah, how do you break that cycle? Well, that's why Isaac is so necessary. That's why this pastoral lab is so necessary. It provides the exemplars, it provides the role models for others, and it provides the networking that they need. Because I think if you're one of the few leaders and you look around and you feel more isolated, you need networks to support you and to encourage you to keep on going. It's difficult, as you said.
Russell, you sound like you went through pastoral lab. That's what exactly pastorals are saying.
It's kind of hard to articulate too, because now having graduated from one cohort and well into my second year with my second cohort, I'm just now realizing like I can actually articulate how much it has increased my confidence as a leader and that I belong in this space, because I think there's just a tendency to dismiss that, like, oh, because I don't have those exemplars, I must not really fit in this space. I'm not really a leader. And I think that's a tendency of so many of us.
Yeah, I think one of the importances of having an institutional space where maybe minoritized members could come together is that a lot of times your giftings, your talents, your particular insights are neglected, and you don't realize that you have these insights. You don't realize that you have these strengths until you come together with others who share those strengths and you see them in each other. And once you begin to share them and then build on your collective strengths, then you could share it with your communities or your congregations. But we need those institutional spaces to help promote women's giftings, to have those particular teachings or insights or interpretations, because there's no other opportunity to develop that when you're in isolation, I think. And I know myself, when I've had particular spaces, even as like an Asian American academic or as a Christian leader, it's really helpful to meet others who share the same interests, who have the same insights, and then you could, bounce ideas off of them, talk about your experiences, and then realize, oh, you do have something to contribute. You have something unique to share. And that's really helpful to have others who are reinforcing you to know that you have a message that's important that others need to hear.
Cris, wouldn't you say that in pastoral lab, you don't have to explain who you are and your presence and why you look the way you look?
Or even the frustrations you might be feeling. Like you don't even really have to utter a word. You're just instantly among people who get you. And that's really what Pastoral Lab does, is it creates a sense of belonging in a community. And then we have Young nudging us to get, equity at the pulpit and with ordination. But so how would you see, Russell, like when we create space for Asian American women faith leaders to contribute in this way, how does that affect the larger movement, would you say, for justice and equity within both the church and society in general?
Yeah. I think promoting Asian American women in ministry is part of the justice work, larger justice work. So it's not a part of it, but it's a key aspect of doing justice and reflecting the kingdom of God. For me, we used to sing that song, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and its righteousness," and that means pursuing right relations, not just with God, but with each other, with our communities, with our societies, and with the creation. And if we're not in right relations, if there's an imbalance, if
Mm-hmm.
there's inequality, then that's wrong and not God's kingdom. And so for me, promoting equality in leadership is part of God's kingdom and a piece of the justice work.
I would also add, in Chinese definition of sickness is imbalance. So in addition to kingdom work, it's also, if you don't have that balance, then you're basically sick. You cannot be healthy. So for the sake of healthy leadership and a healthy body of Christ, that all representation matters for everybody who are parts of that body.
Yeah. I think our Asian American congregations in some way do face ill health and are sick because we don't have that balance. And I could give you a concrete example of just what I've been learning about myself and um, as a male leader myself and realizing, oh, a lot of there's a there's a continued exodus of the second generation in Asian American churches. And one of the primary reasons is that people complain of toxic leadership, of abusive, authoritarian systems, and again, maybe a lack of corporate ownership of the congregation.
Mhm.
And and for me, I've never been bothered by strong male leadership, and I realized because it was normalized for me, right? Because that's how I grew up. But then I realized, oh, I became one of those toxic male leaders because I benefited from it, and I didn't know how to act otherwise. So
Mhm.
using my voice to get my way, feeling maybe more privileged to speak out, using anger as a way to control. Those are all toxic patterns that I realized they're not Asian patterns. They're not Christian,
Mhm.
biblically given mandates. They're just what I was found to be normalized. And if I had maybe in my youth different models of leadership, different
Mhm.
models of emotional intelligence, different models of communication, maybe I wouldn't be as a poor of a leader as I am now, right? And so that's the loss of having of not we continue and maintain maybe a male dominated system that isn't really helpful, nurturing, compassionate, isn't a good a witness as it could be. And so for me, having more women in leadership would contribute to the broader
Yeah.
cause of justice and equity by breaking down these patriarchal patterns that are so toxic.
Well, Russ, you are too hard on yourself.
No.
You are one of the few Asian American male allies that are models, and you mean it. You don't just talk, you walk your talk. So you have our respect, and we don't feel that you are toxic Asian American male. Rather, you're an exception. So coming from me, I'm picky. I always look for people, not just what they say, but what they do. And you're one of those few who embody and pretty authentic. So when you speak, I listen. You don't just talk for the sake of talk. And so we appreciate you. You are not just power mongering, you mean business. And your leadership is embodied leadership. So remember that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, your tendency to lead with vulnerability is very refreshing. I'm curious what you mentioned the data about second generations leaving the church, the Asian American church, but what other than the data that you saw prompted you to raise your self-awareness about what, where you were as a leader? And to hear you say, like, you realize you had become a toxic leader and you were using your power as a male. What prompted that? Because that's it. I feel like getting there is the hardest part. And how can, like, women, how can we be a part of helping to raise that awareness?
I think it's God teaching me through failure of some of not leading well in certain situations, harming people with my communication style. And so it's been really humbling and a learning process. And I think, I've read and heard a lot about Asian Americans complaining about um, abusive, toxic churches. And I sort of wondered, I didn't really get it because, again, it was normalized
It's
for me.
fine.
And yeah, and I thought, oh, we're supposed to be humble. We're all supposed to learn to submit to one another.
Mm.
And, so in other situations where people felt abused and I didn't, I just wondered, why don't I feel abused
Mm.
as much or harmed as much as these other people? And I realized that's because I benefit from that type of system and I sort of perpetuate and maintain it. And again, I think in a lot of situations, I do practice communication styles that I got in my family system and that I received even in my home church. So I just want to be different now. And so again, I'm looking for models myself of where are leaders who are humble, where are leaders who are not abusive, but empowering and democratic and egalitarian. And so it's just probably from women that I learned that and not from my male brothers who I could tell you one story where I was in a situation where these men were all so authoritarian. It just sort of took me aback. And they were really good at following a leader because that's how they expect leadership to be. They're just sort of like, in one setting, really sheep-like without any critical thinking. But then I think they were sheep-like because they're used to following strong leaders, and that's their model, that they should be strong leaders and other people should follow them like sheep. And so the sheep and shepherd model for me was sort of weird to see because it was so top down.
Russell, I think what I'm hearing, I think you're confessing that you want to be wholesome. I'm just quoting Carl Jung, Jungian psychology, where men needs to be in touch with their feminine side, and then women also need to be in touch with their masculine side, and women's masculinity is not the same as male masculinity. So that whole language of anima and animus, that the journey towards becoming whole is, when you look at Jesus, who is humble at the cross, but at the same time, he turned the table upside down at the temple. So when do we show up with that kind of anger, righteous anger, rather than enabling injustice? And when do we get to be willing to be crucified for the sake of something greater? So I think balancing again, we don't want to be just like a doormat, but we also need to have that anger, righteous anger. So having both of them is what Jungian psychology calls wholeness.
Yeah, so we need that wholeness in ourselves as individuals, but we need that wholeness in our congregations as well.
Right.
And again, without the lack of women, with the lack of women in leadership, we're not whole, we're not balanced. So even I may have one leadership style, but I need to be complemented by others with a different leadership style. So we all lead with different giftings. Some people are the emotional glue to a group, and I'll never really be that. Others will be more of the verbal, expressive leaders and more out front. But the emotional glue people or the administrative people are just as important. So I think we all need that balance and that leadership.
I'd like to name how then the followers of the leaders in group dynamic, they enable and they act like cowards. There's some kind of group bias as well. Under strong leader, everybody just line up, total line, rather than saying, wait a minute, I dissent. But everybody just follows. So followers also enable strong leader, even though they feel that it's not right. So it's complicated, but loud voice gets away because followers are not willing to name names.
Yeah, I agree. We may be off topic, but I think you need structures to in systems so that even if you have a strong leader and you have followers, it's way more efficient. But I think some strong leaders are also willing to listen, and we just need communication vehicles for those stronger leaders to hear what the rest of the people are saying. So
Because churches monologue and churches lack feedback system.
yeah,
So that's why at Pastoral Lab, we collect feedback. And then because women are not used to giving honest, authentic feedback, even in family system and church system, they think feedback is just, pleasing. I'm emphasizing be brutally honest. We can handle your feedback, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The function of feedback is to constantly improve the program. But I'm realizing that is countercultural to many Asian American women.
yeah. And maybe they give feedback in indirect ways. And we have to be aware of those indirect ways that feedback is given.
And sometimes I think it's informed by past trauma. Like maybe they've tried to give feedback in the past and it wasn't received very well.
Fear
Yes.
of rejection, yes.
Fear, yeah.
And you just learn to be silent and have that learned helplessness. That's frustrating.
Yeah, it is.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's changing. People can learn and relearn and unlearn.
Yeah. Well, Jung's a great model for that too. Asking us for feedback, but also receiving it and making changes and stuff. So,
Mhm.
let's go back a little to your work with Stop AAPI Hate. And I'm wondering if you see parallels between the fight against anti-Asian, hate, violence, racism, and the movement for gender equity in the church. Do you think there are some parallels there? What might those be?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels that in fighting racism and in fighting gender inequality, the targets of change aren't necessarily individuals like this male pastor has to change his way. I mean, individuals do need to change, but it's more we need to change systems and institutions. We need to change the ideologies and the language and discourses that shape our thinking. And so the more Isaac can help promote system change and narrative change, I think that reaches a broader group. That's what we tried to do at Stop AAPI Hate is, yeah, there's a lot of interpersonal violence,
Mhm.
but we're not going to change people one by one. It's easier to change policies or to stop xenophobic politicians that are pushing people down the river. So we need to go upstream to figure out what the problem is. And so what's upstream that's causing all this gender inequality? Again, maybe it's the theologies, maybe it's the lack of clear models. And so
Mm.
I think the approach to addressing these problems are similar in that we need to do that narrative change work. We need to change the systems.
So year one of Pastoral Lab, we focus on locating your social locations and also multivocal identity as Asian American women faith leaders. Year two, I get pushback because we use adaptive leadership, thinking that many women don't have that concept of a systemic concept, structural concept, organizational concept. And agility and adaptivity these days in radically changing culture, digital culture, is so necessary. But sometimes I get pushback. Why do we have to go through this book? We use that adaptive leadership and it doesn't have Bible verses. So I'm supplementing with institutional intelligence, Christian president written by, I forget his name. Anyway, you are definitely right on. We need to think structural level, not just individual level. And how do we bring change and breed change agents? That's critical.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, I think the pastoral labs are creating these change agents who just embody what we want to see, right? Again, that wholesomeness, that sense of justice. So it's both top down, we need the system change, the narrative change, but also bottom up, we need individuals who can embody the values we want to see.
I want to switch to then. I hear that this space is a very needed space of belonging, but at the same time, share some insights with me and Cris. there's a trauma, money trauma, and scarcity mentality among Asian American faith leaders. How do you think we can move beyond that and really invest in some of our mission?
Yeah, that scarcity mindset shapes a lot of our practices, how we eat, how we travel, how we spend money, and how we give.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just in my small group last night talking about how it's hard for us to give, and even though in our we're earning more money, but the percentage of our giving hasn't
Yeah.
maintained at that, like we haven't tithed at our higher level. And then now we're beginning to save for retirement instead, as we're sort of concerned about the economic situation. So that the trauma and that scarcity, it's real. I think it's valid. If you're always sort of hungry or grew up with scarcity and food insecurity, you do want to have some sense of security. But I think what we need to hear is the joy of giving and being connected
Mm-hmm.
to each other in that way, that God calls us not to just save for ourselves, but to work so that we can share with others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we do need to be healed from the scarcity trauma and instead experience the joy of giving. And for me, just being able to both not only give to organizations or to individuals, but also to pray for them, just knits me together more with them and makes me feel like I can't be everywhere, ministering
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. There's all these issues, there's all these causes, there's all these ministries that I would like to support people abroad. I can't be in Cambodia, I can't be in
Mm-hmm.
Palestine, but I could support people doing the work in those places. And so my prayers and my money then can help me be part of the global church, can help me overcome that
Mm-hmm.
scarcity trauma, and then give me that joy of being, participants in God's work together.
So I'd like to replace scarcity and money trauma into investors, whether it's a $5 or $10 a month. Once you kind of begin to take action by giving even a cup of coffee amount, then you begin to see yourself as an investor. I think that whole philanthropic value that can be taught. So I'm an optimist, and I think we can turn the corner, even in spite of firestorm and everything, as we are moving towards a campaign coming up. We're trying to increase monthly donors. This podcast is not free. It takes equity work. So if people can think about, hey, 7,500 people download our podcast. So listeners out there, we'd love to hear from you. And if you want this podcast to continue long term, then we need to hear from you. And just what's cup of coffee amount if you can donate. Isaac is a 501c3 nonprofit. We rely on public support, and we'd like to mobilize Asian American Village to become investors. We're not talking about $1 million, $billion. We're talking about $10 a month, $20 if you can, and more, so that we can really continue to equip our faith leaders beyond seminary menu, that they don't teach about financial equity, financial competencies. So I had to learn it on my own, but I think that's really a bread and butter issue. And so someone like you out there championing for AAPI causes, and you are our voice. Many Asian American women to this day say, I gain my voice and I have to shout. You do have a voice. Claim it. That's the situation we are in, and we have to amplify our voice more than ever. And your work, Russell. Cris?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Unless you had some last words of wisdom for us, I think we can let you go. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Young Lee just said about investing. And for me, I think a lot about the parable of the talents, and we could just hide what we have for ourselves, or we could just invest a little. But if we invest and our gifts multiply, then we could enter into the joy of the master.
Mm.
And for me, that's the aim. I want to hear at the end, well done, good and faithful servant, enter the joy of your master. And so, um, yeah, please participate in the joy of giving and in the joy of the master.